Thank you for joining us at Miniature Wargaming Labs, and today we're going to cover how we painted the new Primaris Chaplain from the Indominus box set. One of my favorite little models. So, to get started, we put down some primer. And even though his armor's black, I chose a gray primer. And the reason for that is it makes it easier to put some of these other colors on to bring it up from the black. Now for the primer, I chose Standard Mechanicus Gray. But if spending $20 to $22 a bottle for a spray paint primer is not your bag, I recommend Uniform Gray from Army Painter. This is normally available in almost every friendly local game store because it is cheaper than Games Workshop stuff. But if you can't find this, or you want something cheaper, more available, you can always use Krylon Color Max Primer Gray. Now, this works just fine. I use it, especially love it on metal models. But be careful when spraying it because it has a lot of output, so it could fill in a lot of these details. So, for the paints here, we won't be using any contrast, we won't be using any technical paints. We are going to be using paints that you can find in the various starter paint sets from Games Workshop, Army Painter, WizKids, Fantasy Flight Games. So commonly available paints, and we're going to be using brushes. Don't worry about brand on brushes. Go to Michael's, go to your friendly local game stores, go to Games Workshop. But for this model, pretty much just used a beat up brush that I have here for applying my Nuln Oil, and 3 fine point brushes that I use for various things. Honestly, you could get away with just one fine tip brush. And then I had a different slop brush that's got this little flat edge, just when I wanted to slop on the black at the first step, which you'll see. Now let's talk about the paints used. Now, this model's largely black, so his armor's being done in Abaddon Black. Now, to highlight his armor, did some Fenris Gray, and then just a touch highlight above that with Mechanicus Standard Gray. Now, since he's going to be an Ultramarine, I used his blue shoulder pad. I started off with Macrage Blue, worked up to Altdorf Guard Blue, and at the pinnacle, he had a little blend of Crystal Blue. Now, for the gold trim you see here, used Balthazar Gold with Auric Armor Gold, and in between those I had a little wash of Reichland Flesh Shade. And for his skin there, I used Barbarian Flesh and Reichland Flesh Shade. For his robes and his purity seals, we used Iron Rack Skin and Pallid Witch Flesh. And for the various metal bits, used Lead Belcher and Runefang Seal. So basically metal and silver. Now for the red on his purity seals, his eye, I used Evil Sun Scarlet and Troll Slayer Orange. For the pages in his book, I used Xandri Dust. And where's my Nuln Oil? Nuln Oil. Use that on a lot of the model, especially this brings out the details in the Crozia staff. Paint it red, put some Nuln Oil, it'll go into the seams. You don't have to paint all those little squares. Alright, now we have our supplies marked out. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so to get started, the Chaplain is made largely of black, and I primed him gray. So let's start blocking him in. Alright, I'm going to carry on blocking in the black of his armor, and we'll be back in a moment. Alright, so I've got all the areas I want blocked in. I didn't do a neat job because I don't have to at this stage. Since it's the first color down, we're going to build from it, so we'll clean it up as we move along. So the first thing I want to do is, as this is an ultramarine, I want the inside of his pauldron to be macrage blue. So quick touch of blue on the inside there. There. Got that covered. Next thing I want to do is paint the handle red. For that, I'm going to use Evil Sun Scarlet. Alright, got a little purity seal over here. I'm going to paint that red. Let's see if there's any more purity seals. Alright, looks like we're good there. Next step, we're going to put on our metal color. And for that, I'm going to use Lead Belcher. So this is primarily going to go on the gun. So you notice when I start doing some of these colors, like especially around his hands, I'm hitting his fingers. Don't worry about that. Like I said, we're going to do some touch-ups on his armor as we move further along the process. One thing you don't want to do is keep on going back and forth trying to touch up areas that you got wrong. Just keep moving forward on the paint jobs. Alright, now we're going to get his belt buckle. Alright, happy with that so far. Almost forgot the little electronics up around his head. I'm going to go ahead and paint these metal color. Since there's so much black on him, I want as much spot colors to bring out character in the model. Alright. Now I'm going to use some Dumbbell Brown. Oops. We're going to paint this book. The reason I'm doing the book now is because it's tough to get back there. So if I bump my brush on anything, I can clean it up as I work my way from the inside out of the model. Alright, then I'm going to get some Mechanicus Standard Gray, and he's standing on a little rock there. Good. So, the next step, and then we're going to take a little break because it's going to take a while to clean up, is we are going to use some Nuln Oil, or as I call it, liquid talent. And normally I coat the whole model in this stuff, but the guy's already black. It's already as dark as he's going to get. So I am going to instead take a brush that I have beaten to heck, this one, wet the bristles, and then I'm going to grab a little bit. I'm going to do the middle around his head. So all the colors I just painted on, I'm going to give him a good drubbing with Nuln Oil. So I went around. The nice thing about the Nuln Oil is it'll go into the cracks. The handle is Crozius and fill in those black lines that were etched by the modeler, which saves us the problem of going around it and painting that in. Alright, so we're going to let him dry and we'll be back in a moment. So our Chaplain has dried. Now ready to block in the next section. And for that, I'm going to start with the areas I want white. Well, not exactly white, an off-white called Ion Rack Skin. And I'm going to use that on his tabard. And there's actually little bones right here, or at least the pretense of bones. So I'm going to paint those. Alright, got the bones outlined. Alright, so I've got the tabard and the bone. Next I'm going to do these purity seals. Alright, looks like I've got all the purity seals. Alright, next I want to do is his head. And while his head's not going to be this color, I want his head to be a little bit brighter. Next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to let that white dry, which is fine because the next color is going to be Balthazar Gold. And with that, I am going to base and block in all the parts I want gold. And on this model it's going to be a lot. So we're going to have the chest eagle, the edging of the plating, the crozius, all the iron halo, a lot of the decorative bits. So I'm going to get started on that. Since this is basing, pretty standard, just one light coat, not too thin down, in my opinion, since I'm trying to cover up the gray. And we'll keep on going around the model, and we'll be back in a moment. Alright, I finished putting on the Balthazar Gold. You can see we did a lot of the trim work around the armor plates, on his gauntlets, greaves, crozius, little decorative spots on the gun. And now we're going to do some more details here. I want to go back to my red, because I just noticed on his little book that there is a purity seal. So we'll just put a little dot right there. And I want to highlight some of his pages and the little bands there. So for that, I'm going to get some Xandri dust. Make sure it's thinned down to the right consistency that I want. This is a matter of personal preference. And we're just going to draw right between the spines. Alright, now I want to do the little bands around the book. I was thinking about what color I wanted to do those in. I think I'll go ahead and do those in Iron Rack Skin again. Got that covered. Now next, I want to do flesh on his head. And I'm going to go with Barbarian Flesh from Army Painter. Games Workshop used to call this dwarf flesh. So, just need a little spot of it. I'm going to thin this down, a drop of water. Now, got some little chains. I'm going to paint those silver. So let's go with my Rune Fang steel. Alright, got the silver on there. And I think we're ready for the next level of wash. And for that, I'm going to use Chaplain Flesh Aid. I'm going to just put a thin layer of this on all the pieces I painted gold. See, on his tabard and on the simulated bone. See, I put too much on here, and you see the wash is getting caught between the little gaps, so I'm just spreading it around to the other parts I needed to do. As the wash dries, it'll form like this little bubble film, and if it pops, it leaves this residue behind. So, alright. Good. Now on the tabard, I like a more even coat, so as it dries, I go back and I push it back up. Kind of like what you do with contrast paints. Now I think his head's dried enough. Go ahead and put some wash on there. Alright, I think the wash is starting to add some character to the model. I think at this point we're going to let it dry and come back in a moment. So our model is dry. Now the next step that I'm going to do is, he actually has a metal plate on the side of his head. So I'm going to paint that up. For that I'm going to use lead belcher. Alright, next step, I'm going to do these white surfaces. The purity seals and the bone I'm going to do a little bit differently than I'm going to do the tabard. And this is to give it the look that they're made out of different materials. So to start with the tabard, I'm going to take the iron rack skin and I'm going to do a highlight. So I'm just going to put thin coats of this white, like I did there, and we'll just leave the brown and the deep surfaces there to give it the look of light catching in folds. Alright, we'll finish up that and then I'll be back. Alright, so we finished putting the iron rack skin over the top of the tabard, front and back. I left this a little bit darker. You'll apply the iron rack up in layers to get the kind of color you're looking for. Now with I'm going to use pallid witch flesh here to add just a top layer and a few select spots in the tabard. Alright, now I'm going to use the pallid witch flesh on the purity seals, and it's just going to be highlight down the edge and then just a few cuts across on the raised areas. Alright, so I'm going to finish doing all these purity seals and then we'll be back. Now, looking at where I am with the model, I'm going to turn my attention to the gold, and there's a lot of it. Now, I'm going to use Arc Armor Gold. And I'm going to take my fine tip brush here, and I'm just going to do highlight touches along the edges the raised surfaces. Now on the sides here where there's not a raised edge, I'm going to imagine that there's a light source coming down hitting the model, and I'll vary how much that flat surface gets the new art gold. I'll just brush it along right there. Don't worry about the black, we can touch that up later. This is just to give it some depth. Now we're going to finish touching up all the gold. Now that we've finished highlighting with the auric gold, you can see the figure is really starting to pop with the brightness of the gold and the darkness of the armor. Now, the next step is I want that gold to really shine. And for that, I'm going to use Runefang steel. So this is going to be whatever bright silvery color you have. And we're going to just do little spot highlights. So what I said before is imagine there's a light source coming down, and so this silver will go pretty much just where you'd imagine the light would be reflecting the most. So we just put little spots everywhere. You don't want to overdo this or it'll start looking like it's not gold. There. So we just keep on going like that all over the model. Just light touches. Alright, so I've got my silver highlights on the gold like I want, and since I have the silver out, I'm going to touch up those areas of lead belcher that were previously washed, and this will allow them to shine. So we'll do his belt buckle, and I want to get Alright, so I've got the lead belcher parts highlighted. Now, next thing I want to do, and you might miss this detail, so I'm going to take some Evil Sun Scarlet. And I want to try to get to his eye. I'm just going to put a little dot. There, I got his little bionic eye. And now I want to take some Troll Slayer Orange and I'm going to put little highlights on the purity seals. There's one hidden behind his shoulders here on both sides. Alright, next I'm going to do highlights on his face. And so I'm going to go back to Barbarian Flesh. I'm only going to need a touch of it. And so here I'm going to use the Barbarian Flesh to hit the highlights of his face. Alright, next I'm going to tackle this shoulder pad. So for my Ultramarines, I always start off with Macrage, Nuln Oil it, and then I put on Altdorf Guard Blue. Yeah, alright. Now I'm going to start at the top here, and what I do is I normally put the paint at the top and then I start spreading it down until I get the shade of blue that I like. And what I'll do is I'll pull this paint down till right about here, adding various layers until I get that blue color I want. Right, so I finished blending the blue onto the shoulder pad, but I was looking at the original painting the model and they painted the knee blue. So I'm going to go ahead and just take my Altdorf Guard Blue, fill in that knee. All right. All right, so the next stop on the blue is I'm going to take some Army Painter Crystal Blue, and I'm just going to put like the slightest dot in here because I don't need that much. And then I'm going to put some of the Altdorf Guard blue on my brush, take some of that Army Painter, and just mix it until I'm happy with the color. And where before I would come down 75% of the blue, I'm just going to there. I'm only going to come down maybe 30% of the way. So we've got this gradation of blue, and we're going to go back to this Army Painter, and I'm just going to create a little highlight, show where the light's culminating at the top of the pauldron. And since it's all wet, I can kind of blend the colors together. So I'm liking how that looks in the shadowing. And I'll just come down to this knee and do something similar down there. I'm going to put the little ultramarine transfer down there. Now, the next step is I've got all these purity seals, and I want them to look like they have stuff written on them. So what you do is I get like the smallest tip brush I have. Just get a little touch of paint. Don't need that much on the tip. And then I just start squiggling my hand across the purity seal, creating these squiggly lines to kind of look like it's writing on there. Now you don't have to just use black ink. I've used red, blue. You don't even have to paint the purity seals white like parchment. You can do them like red parchment. So, written on that purity seal. Now I'll go around and finish up the purity seals, but one of the biggest things that will make this guy pop is we're going to highlight his armor now. And for that, I am going to use Fenris Gray. So I'm going to get some paint out here. Going to need to thin it down because I want it to flow right onto the model. So, to highlight the armor, this is a really dark grade with a hint of blue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load my brush with paint up, halfway up the brush. I'm just going to make sure like the thinnest amount of the paint's on, and I'm going to take the flat of the brush and just rub it down these raised panels. And these panels, I'm pretty much just wanting the top where the light you'd see the light come down. So edge highlight those panels, and I'm going to go around and finish the rest of the edge highlighting on the model. Alright, so I finished highlighting the armor with Fenris Gray, and I finished filling in the purity seals. Now, the last touch I'm going to make, and you don't have to do this, I'm going to take some Mechanicus Standard Gray, and I only want little bits of it, because I'm going to do a second edge highlighting on the armor. And where with the Fenris Gray, I did a lot of the parts. With this one, I'm just going to do little touches at like the top parts. And it'll just change the tint, give it a little gradation in color. Alright, I'm going to call that a day on that highlighting. So you just need little bits, and it kind of like softens some of the highlights there. So I'm going to call that a day on this guy, and I'll base it to match the rest of my Ultramarines, and that's up to your personal taste. But thank you for joining us at Miniature Wargaming Labs, and we'll see you next time.